Okay guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to talk about cooling systems. Cooling system that keeps your motor from overheating. So let's start off right with the radiator cap, the thing that people take off most often. Thing is, you don't want to take this off when it's hot. If you take it off when it's hot, you're going to get yourself really hurt and burned. So one of the things I always do is I check to see if my car's got pressure in it, and to see if it's too hot. And how I do that is I go to this part right here called the upper radiator hose, and I grab it and I squeeze it. And by grabbing, I can feel if it's hot. Now, it doesn't feel hot at all, and I can squeeze the hose pretty easily, so there's not a lot of pressure in it. All right, so let's go to the radiator cap. That is our radiator cap. Now, this is like child-proof. It just does not twist off. You got to kind of push down with your palm and twist off at the same time. It's got like little notches on the side that this grabs, and you see there's a spring and a gasket here. So when this builds up a lot of pressure, it will push on the spring and allow coolant to go through the skinny little hose that goes down and goes to our overflow bottle. A lot of people just add to this, but that's not really the right place to add. This is your overflow bottle. You'll see that sometimes this will go up, go down, but where we really want to check is inside the radiator itself. And I'm looking down in there and it's looking kind of low, so I might have a leak, which we're going to do a test on. We're going to pressure test the system. But let's talk about some parts of this cooling system. So we have our radiator, which we'll talk about more later. We have our upper radiator hose, which goes down here to a housing, and inside that housing is a piece called a thermostat. Now this thermostat, it opens at a certain temperature, kind of like the thermostat on your wall. It kind of keeps your room a certain temperature. This keeps our engine a certain temperature. So, I mean, say it's a coolant temperature starts off at 70 degrees, and then from our explosions from our motor, it keeps heating up that antifreeze and heating it up. And then when it gets to, say, 200 degrees, that valve opens up, and coolant will flow into our radiator, and air from this fan will be sucked through the radiator fins and cooling it down and maintaining about 200 degrees of temperature. Now if you look way down here, I don't know if you guys can see it, but there's another hose. That big hose there is called our lower radiator hose, which is where coolant flows from the radiator into the engine. And everything is pushed by this center pulley right here, which is our water pump. Alright, now let's talk about the heat inside our dash for a second. So we have coolant also runs through these hoses, this one here, and goes all the way to here inside our dashboard, where there's a tiny little radiator called a heater core. And then we also got a return hose. And then there's a little valve here, which is called a bypass valve. So when your heat is not in use, like say you're using air conditioning, this will block hot antifreeze from going into your heater core. And it's called a bypass valve. Alright, so let's take a peek at our radiator. I got one out of a car, taken out of a car. So this is where our upper radiator hose would go. This is where our lower radiator hose would go. But if you look, you see these tiny little tubes? So antifreeze goes from this tank, flows through these tiny tubes, not the fins, but the tiny like little straw tubes, from one side of the radiator to the other. And as it goes through, air blows, gets sucked through it. And when you're driving, it comes through the grill, and air flows through here and cools it down. So it might enter at one side of the radiator, say at 225, and it might leave somewhere about 100 degrees. All right, it's constantly circulating. They commonly get damage to them. Now this is out of a race car, but most of your radiators, they have plastic tanks and they tend to crack. Another thing that happens with radiators is sometimes these fins rot. Another thing that happens is a rock might damage it. Sometimes they get blocked up. These tubes get blocked with calcium deposits and mud and dirt and grime, and they don't flow, and like only half the radiator works, and sometimes they have to be replaced for that reason. Alright, what we're going to do next is we're going to wind up doing what's called a pressure test. So I'll see you in a minute. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to inspect my radiator cap, and we're going to pressure test the system. So let's look at this radiator cap. So it says 16 psi, so that's the rating of the spring of when this opens at 16 psi. It goes to the overflow, and you inspect your gaskets. Now my gasket looks crappy, that this thing could have possibly been leaking out of my cap. Then if you look, I've hooked up this pressure tester. So the kit comes with a cap that fits this radiator. I screw that on, I put my hose on, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to wind up pumping it up to 16 psi, and then we're going to visually look for some leaks. So I push this handle back and forth, and you'll see my needle start to rise. And right about where blue and yellow meet is 16 psi. Now if you got a really big leak, you'll notice the arrows start dropping real fast. But I think I got a slow leak, so let's start looking. So let's look at the radiator tank. And it looks nice and dry. I don't see anything so far. Let's look at this side radiator tank. And I'm not really seeing anything. We'll inspect. So the tanks tend to crack. They also tend to leak where the hose meets, which I'm not seeing anything. So we'll follow the other end to where it meets the thermostat. I don't see anything. I don't see anything coming out of my heater hose right there. Where's my other heater hose? The other heater hose comes down that way, which I really can't see anything. Check the heater hoses over here. Got a bypass valve. Let's take a peek under the car, look at the lower part of the radiator. So you get under the car and you look for wetness, which I'm not seeing anything. And we try to look up to the water pump. I'm seeing some oil. Looks like I got an oil leak, but I'm not really seeing any antifreeze leaking. I'm looking at this lower hose where the heater tube comes in, and I'm not seeing anything wrong there either. So maybe I don't have a coolant leak, maybe it's just a bad radiator cap. That's a quick way to pressure test your system. Alright guys, so some of your main parts of your coolant system. Radiator, which would be located in the front of the car. Upper radiator hose. Lower radiator hose. The fan shroud. Water pump. Thermostat, probably one of the most common things to go bad. Heater hoses. And heater core. So you can have leaks from your hoses, your intake manifold, your thermostat, cylinder heads, radiator, water pump, many different components.